So what do you say we take a break from Disney's Star Wars to talk about something that's actually good? I've had Amazon Prime for a while now, but I wasn't exactly sure what I could watch with it. There was a big library of content, but nothing that really interested me. But in the meantime, I have been hearing about this new exclusive called Invincible. It had a pretty iconic voice cast behind it too. Mark Hamill, Steven Yeun, and of course, Omni-Man voiced by J.K. Simmons. Cue the obvious Spider-Man jokes. I'll admit the show did look somewhat interesting, but it wasn't something I got into right away. I heard about its growing popularity around the internet and even saw some pretty funny out-of-context memes. This show was steadily becoming a big deal, and eventually my curiosity piqued and I checked out some clips on YouTube. And from what I saw, it looked pretty cool. A more dramatic take on the superhero genre that explored the realistic aspects of being a superhero, while also relieving itself of the PG and PG-13 rating that you'd normally get in DC and Marvel stories. This allowed the series to be more upfront with its violence and show the realistic effects of this kind of power. What would really happen if someone with Superman's raw strength punched someone in the stomach or slammed their heads? I was also interested in some of the character arcs, with the main character learning about his powers and finding out the truth about his father. But I knew that if I was going to get a real impression of the show that I'd have to watch it all the way through. So I sat down, put on Amazon Prime, watched the whole thing through, and I gotta say, Invincible is good. Like, really good. In fact, it's surprisingly good. I wasn't expecting the show to catch my interest so quickly, but it's become one of the best that I've seen in a long time. I should probably start this off by saying I'm not entirely familiar with the comics as I've never read any of them directly, but I thought it'd be best to get a grasp of the source material before tackling the show. I've seen some retrospective videos and even some motion issues in order to get an idea of what the show is adapting, at least in terms of the first season. What they adapted was pretty faithful to the original story and even surprising at times. For example, in the comics when Omni-Man kills the Guardians of the Globe, they only show some panels of them being quickly executed. But in the show, it's a full-fledged fight between Omni-Man and the Guardians, and it doesn't hold back any punches in terms of how violent and gruesome it can get. It takes a slower pace, yet it feels like it naturally flows, capturing the terror of Omni-Man and showing the power that the Viltrumites are capable of and why they should be feared. And what makes it so terrifying is that Nolan doesn't say anything to them. No dialogue, no speech, no quote about how it's for the greater good. He just gives them a cold stare as he slaughters them. It's really intimidating and makes him far more threatening than in the comics. The conclusion to episode 1 perfectly sets the tone for the rest of the show and works as a really clever shift with the more lighthearted nature of the other 35 minutes. It progressively sets up the story surrounding Mark discovering his powers and learning about the responsibilities of being a hero while also establishing other aspects of the world. We also see the lives of the Guardians before Omni-Man kills them. On a surface level it might seem pointless, but it works here because it helps to humanize the characters. We get to see them on a more personal level, spending time with loved ones, doing their day-to-day routine outside of being a hero, and delve into more of their individual personalities. So when we get to the funeral scenes, it feels genuinely sad, because we see not just how much the Guardians meant to the world, but also to the people they were close to. Olga's despair at Joseph's death and Nolan's eulogy really shows how they weren't just superheroes. These were real people that Nolan killed. It's actually impressive how they're able to create an attachment to characters who got a minimum of screen time. It's also helped by the amazing voice acting they got for all the characters. A lot of people praise J.K. Simmons as Omni-Man, but the other actors do a really good job too. Each voice fits the assigned character perfectly, and they do a fantastic job carrying the emotional weight of more dramatic scenes. The inflection, the range in their tone, and the way they mix all sorts of different expressions makes each of their performances incredibly convincing, and it adds so much personality to the characters, making conversations between them feel much more organic and real. The progression of the plot is also done evenly, shifting between plot threads relating to different aspects of Mark, Nolan, and Mark's friends while having a slice-of-life element to it. They correspond with the mystery surrounding the death of the Guardians, Mark training with his father, and Mark dealing with the reality and responsibility of being a superhero. But they don't feel like they're disrupting each other, and they tie together properly by the end of the season with nothing feeling rushed or unresolved. With the way each episode is paced, each of the subplots are given enough time to develop as the story surrounding Nolan's deception and his relationship with his family unfolds. And the formula in which the season operates allows each episode to build off of each other, contributing to the main story while still being its own self-contained plot. It also maintains a consistent tone where it never feels like you're being hit with any sort of mood whiplash. It can be relaxing, down-to-earth, intense, dramatic, humorous, but it never feels out of place. Each of these moments are spaced out properly from each other and feature the right characters to deliver these scenes, so you feel invested in just about every situation the show throws at you. The mystery surrounding Omni-Man is also made very interesting because of how it's paced and how his true motivations are cleverly hinted at. The eventual reveal of how he wasn't sent to Earth as a protector but rather a scout preparing the planet for Viltrum's conquest is a really good twist because it's a mystery that ends on a satisfying answer. Now when you rewatch the season, there's a lot of things that make more sense, from the real reason why Nolan is concerned about Mark's powers to lines like this.
You don't seem to understand. Earth isn't yours to conquer.
There's also this really good detail regarding the show's title card. In the first episode, it's a clear image of blue and yellow colors, symbolizing the story centered around Mark. It's bright and colorful, and it perfectly captures the heartfelt tone of the episode. But after Omni-Man kills the Guardians, the title card appears with a splatter of blood, symbolizing that this superhero show is not as soft as it first appeared. With each episode, the title card gets more and more bloody as the episodes themselves get more and more violent, until the season finale where the title card is drenched in a giant splash of blood, symbolizing the carnage that's about to follow. The title card in episode 1 fools you into thinking it's going to be a lighthearted show, but the increasing amount of blood symbolizes the dark progression of the plot, and the weight of the show's real nature. But the element of Invincible that acts as its core and what makes it a truly great show is the huge cast of characters. There's a lot of characters in this show, meaning there's a lot of character arcs. So many in fact that I think it's best to give the supporting characters their own video separate from the main leads. In spite of how many there are, it never feels overcrowded. The season spaces them out evenly and manages to write all of them great. Except for Amber, but we'll get to her in the next video. First we have Mark's mother Debbie, who is simply the best mom ever. You'd think she would be the odd one out in a family of superheroes, but she leaves a really strong impression. Her time with Mark this season is somewhat brief since it's mostly centered around his father, but she still has a genuine connection with him. The talk she has with him after he discovers his powers feels very down to earth and properly captures the dynamic between these two. Mark feels strong now that he has his powers and thinks he doesn't have to listen to his mother because she doesn't have any over him. But then she says this.
Does that make you feel strong? To know I can't physically make you do something? Is that what you need?
Debbie has accepted the reality of not having powers in a family of superheroes, and she still lets Mark know that she's not going to tolerate his disrespectful attitude. The second he says "make me," she instantly puts him in his place by reminding him that flouting your physical superiority around isn't true strength. And when Mark realizes how stupid he was acting by trying to sound tough, he demonstrates some self-control and decides to just be honest with her. Idolizing his father, wanting to be like him, and worrying about not being able to live up to his legacy. And she tells him to not worry about those things because they shouldn't be what makes up his character. That being his own superhero is what matters. The conversation they have feels like a real mother and son conversation, with Debbie disciplining Mark while still being empathetic and supportive of his situation. She gives him the right guidance while also having a sharp sense of humor, allowing the two to take playful jabs at each other while still having a lighthearted conversation. It's actually really heartwarming that they can share a moment like this with all the time Mark spent leaning toward Nolan. It's a scene that perfectly shows how a non-superpowered person like Debbie can show how similar they are to superpowered people who go through everyday struggles. But what really sells Debbie's character is her dynamic and dilemma with Nolan. The season does an amazing job keeping you invested in their marriage, even with the knowledge of all the horrible stuff he's done. They spend time together, express their love and support for each other, discuss what Mark should be doing with his powers, and in moments of doubt they try to reassure each other. The show takes time to actually explore their relationship as husband and wife, and they do it while being able to juggle the plot point of Debbie investigating him. And when she finally discovers the truth, she does not hold back in facing him. The way she stands up to Nolan, confronting him despite knowing what he's capable of, that he can easily kill her in an instant, that takes a lot of courage. Even after she finds out, you can sense the disbelief that her husband would do such a thing. She tries to make sense out of it, hoping there was a good reason for it. But she sadly has to face the reality that Nolan was just there to conquer the planet. All of this just makes the scene where she finally breaks down even worse. She was holding in those feelings of despair for so long that letting it all out at once, it's just saddening. And even after all that, there's still a part of her hoping it wasn't for nothing. That maybe there's still a part of Nolan where he truly believes the time he spent with his family was real to him. Debbie's willpower in the show is just really impressive. They really improved her character compared to her comic book counterpart and gave her a much more organic role in the story. I really want to see more of her in the next season because she's just that good. Next up is Mark Grayson. The hero's journey he has in this first season is very satisfying, and it has me looking forward to what's in store for him next. It also comes across as an interesting coming-of-age story with the lessons and responsibilities he learns along the way. His cockiness as a hero is understandable considering the way he looks up to his father. He starts out pretty much like all of us, thinking being a superhero is all glory and saving the day. But as he gets more involved, he starts to see the actual hardships and even the scary side of this line of work. Things like the Flaxen invasion really help to sell the idea that Mark is a 17-year-old who's way out of his depth. It caves in the actual reality of being a superhero. No matter how hard the heroes work, there's still gonna be times where the civilians die, and Mark's reaction to the carnage is very on point. He's horrifying and frozen in fear seeing all these people die and feeling a sense of guilt that he couldn't save them. This was a part of the job his father never brought up to him, so it completely catches him off guard and he feels like he's been thrown into a war zone. It's extremely accurate to how a first-time hero would react to this situation and perfectly captures how Mark overestimates himself. And after the talk he has with Eve, he takes the experience to heart and practices preparing himself for this kind of situation better. The way Mark goes from seeing superhero life as fun in games to fully absorbing the hardship that comes with it is paced very well over the course of the season. You spend enough time with him that you feel invested in his day-to-day life. You empathize with his struggles, the peril he gets into, the danger and near-death experiences. That moment where he gets his organs crushed by battle beasts causes a genuine sense of fear for his life, because we see how vulnerable he is and isn't constantly being protected by plot armor. When he gets into a fight with someone out of his league, he really gets injured, but they don't make him weak either. The show makes it clear that Mark is still growing as a Viltrumite and his powers aren't going to peak for a long time. But they still give him bursts of power in a dire situation, showing his potential and what he's capable of when he's learned to fully harness his power. I feel like this is the stuff Rey Palpatine needed so much more of. Moments that don't show the hero as useless and a fully capable warrior, but also putting them in situations where they're not the strongest and can't always win. Showing how there are fighters far stronger than them and they have to keep training and fighting before they can reach that level of power. He also has a really genuine relationship with his family. We already talked about his relationship with Debbie, but his relationship with Nolan is where things get really interesting. As a kid, he looked up to him like an inspiring idol, and while he still does that, he has a much more heart-to-heart connection with him now that he's older. He talks to his father like a close friend or best buddy from school, allowing their conversations to feel more personal. But Mark still looks up to him, wanting to prove to himself that he can live up to him. The scene where he tries to get Nolan to hit him shows how deeply he wants to prove to himself that he can do it. Watching this scene again after the season finale is really bittersweet. You can see how Mark truly looks up to his father as a hero, only for that perspective of him to be shattered later on. The training sessions also give the two a chance to connect while Mark gains experience and knowledge. They take the time to add sincerity and a sense of humor to their exchanges, which gives more variety to the ways they interact. Then comes the shocking reveal that his father is actually a mass-murdering tyrant bent on galactic conquest, and it doesn't hold back any of its brutality. Mark is in such denial that his father is a cold-blooded murderer that his initial reaction is to think someone is controlling him, desperately trying to free Nolan from their spell. It's legitimately heartbreaking seeing him desperately trying to free his father just to find out he's not being controlled. It's just him doing all these terrible things. He's emotionally crushed by this, but it's in this moment where he truly begins to fight to protect Earth. Early on, Mark was arrogant in a few regards due to his power and assuming that being a superhero is fun in games. His perception of his father was that of the greatest hero on Earth. To be in any way like him is good. To be anything less is bad. He thought Nolan was faultless in every way. But now, Mark's idolization of him has been completely shattered, and he immediately stands up to him. All of his life, Mark was striving to be like Omni-Man, but Nolan was using it as a facade. Now, Mark doesn't want to be like Omni-Man. This time, he wants to be better. And what follows would be the ultimate test of Mark's willpower, something that can only be understood by understanding Omni-Man. Nolan Grayson is by far the best character in the show. His entire storyline is fantastically written, from his trembling marriage with Debbie, to his inner conflict regarding his responsibility to Viltrum, to his final showdown with his son. Every scene with this character is raw and genuine, and his journey from a deceitful monster to a father coming to terms with his humanity is a gripping tale from beginning to end. And you might be thinking, how can I speak positively of Omni-Man after all the horrible stuff he did throughout the season? After all the lengths he went through to break his son's spirit? Well, it's because when you think about Nolan's arc beyond the violence and bloodshed, there's actually a deep struggle that resonates strongly with the way his character is developed. For years, Nolan led Mark to believe that Viltrum was a benevolent world of great warriors who made the universe a better place, when in reality, the Viltrumites were planet-conquering tyrants bent on galactic conquest. He was sent to Earth to weaken it from the inside, and prepare its life forms for submission to the Empire. He kept it a secret for so long because Mark was a late bloomer. But now that Mark finally obtained his powers, Nolan must officially begin his mission to conquer the Earth. But the time he spent with his human family has complicated things. It's left him emotionally conflicted because without realizing it, he found something better and more important than the Empire. He found friends and family, people that he cares about and wants to share his life with. But he's also scared of what the Empire will do when they eventually come for Earth. He knows he's not strong enough to defeat Viltrum on his own. So now he's left with two choices. Does he complete his mission and conquer Earth and try to guarantee the safety of his family, or abandon it and focus on his family and protect Earth? The latter choice would risk his life for disobeying orders and endanger Earth and his family even more from Viltrumite invasion, but he also knows that enslaving Earth would be the wrong thing to do. It's left him confused and conflicted, and he decides the only way to defeat these emotions is to find a way to justify his actions to himself, to convince himself that what he's feeling for his family is just part of the mission. But in spite of all his efforts, it ends with him feeling defeated and leaving Earth behind. The ways he tries to reassure Debbie when she begins to doubt him are definitely deceitful, but at the same time, he speaks with an earnest desire to help Debbie feel better. A very interesting detail that you notice as you watch these scenes between them is that Nolan never lies to her, at least not in a direct way. He always says something that's true in relation with the situation. For example, everything he says to her during their trip to Italy is true. He's the only survivor and Cecil suspects him of being the killer. In spite of all the crazy stuff going on, he simply wants Debbie to trust him, hoping it'll make it easier to accept his true motivations. So when he says these things to her, he tries to be as honest as possible while not revealing too much. You can tell there's a lot of times where he wants to tell her the full truth, but he doesn't know how to explain it. And he admits that a part of him wanted her to find out for herself when she confronts him about the suit. He knows he couldn't hide it forever. While rehearsing his speech to Mark, he claims that no one except him would understand, because they're the only Viltrumites on Earth. He couldn't tell Debbie because she wouldn't be able to handle the massive scale of his mission, but in spite of not being able to tell her, he still left clues for her to find. In episode 6, it's shown that he already knows that she already knows the truth, and him standing outside of the house during the final shot as the singer says "I fucked up" shows that Nolan's secret is no longer a secret. He already knew the moment he walked into that house, Debbie was going to confront him, and after she tells him off and walks up the stairs, all he can do is punch the wall in frustration before sitting on the chair, left alone with his own thoughts. He worked really hard to keep Debbie's trust in him, and now that trust is gone. And yet, he never kills her in spite of being perfectly capable of covering it up, because in spite of his loyalty to Viltrum, he still cares about her. He could have lied to her by saying someone was controlling him, but he didn't. While he does hide the full truth from her, he never has the cruelty to tell an outright lie. He doesn't tell a lie because it would lessen her respect for him. He doesn't want her to think less of him because their marriage matters a lot to him. Instead of lashing out at her, he just feels frustrated with himself. And with no other options left, he now decides that it's time to tell Mark the truth. He tries rehearsing what he's going to say, and there's actually some interesting things to pick up from his choice of words. One of the first things he says is that he didn't want to kill the Guardians, how it was part of his responsibility, and the sincerity in his tone heavily suggests that this is true. He might have never told the Guardians he liked them, but he still had a connection with them, working with them to protect the Earth and even mentioning how they helped him feel welcome when he first arrived. Maybe those eulogies were him expressing his guilt over killing them, how it was simply part of his mission and he regrets it had to come to that. If he didn't kill them, the other Viltrumites would've. And at the end of his speech, Nolan tries to finish his sentence claiming that he loves Mark and Debbie more than anything, but he struggles to finish because he's still in conflict with himself, debating whether or not he loves them more than his duty to Viltrum. Nolan's struggle is legitimately interesting. He cares very deeply about his family, but he also has this sense of responsibility for carrying out his culture and heritage. He was simply carrying out a mission, but now his attachment to his family is involved, causing his confidence to shake. He doesn't want to do this anymore, but there's too much at stake to turn back. He doesn't know how to deal with these feelings, leaving him lost and unsure of how to express himself to Mark. It's scenes like this that show how deeply and earnestly he cares about his son. All those training sessions, all those talks about finding himself, becoming a hero, inspiring his son to be better, he wasn't just preparing Mark for conquest, he was spending real quality time with his son, helping the two to start relating better now that they can truly connect over their Viltrum heritage. But now the time has come for him to tell his son the full truth, make him understand the importance of helping Viltrum. But when Mark refuses, Nolan is left with no choice but to fight him. And the tactics he uses, while monstrous and immoral, are actually fascinating in hindsight. Initially, he doesn't want to fight Mark, and you can tell from the subtle expressions on his face. In a way, he understands why Mark is upset with him, allowing him to let his anger out. But he still tries to convince Mark to side with him in the long run. His plan is to convince him how pointless it would be to fight for humanity, explaining their insignificance compared to the larger picture. And throughout most of it, he's not shouting at Mark. He's speaking to him calmly, like he's legitimately trying to explain his side of things. It makes him both rational and intimidating in how he tries to persuade Mark. And to make his point clear, he shows Mark what'll happen to humanity if they try to resist. The inevitable destruction of their world and how powerless they would be to stop it, as well as how pointless it would be for Mark to stand against the Empire, because he can't possibly defeat them by himself. himself. Resistance would be futile, and it would ultimately mean nothing to stand against them. Nolan is trying to show Mark that Viltrum can't be stopped. If he can't defeat his father, what chance does he have against the rest of his people?
How could you do this?
That was your fault. Your stubbornness against the inevitable killed those people. How many more need to die, Mark? It's up to you.
And in spite of that, Mark still fights back. He's clearly fighting a battle that can't be won, but he still doesn't give in. He shows Nolan that no matter what, he will fight to protect the Earth. When the chips were down, Mark showed he was a hero to his core, standing up for what's right, even if there's a 100% chance he'll lose. Even that burst of rage when Nolan tries to disown his mother is a really standout moment. Mark is in disbelief that Nolan would disown his family in such a way, so much that it completely makes him give in to his anger. It really hits home how much he cares about his mother, and how badly his perception of his father has been broken. And every time Mark fights back, Nolan steps up the brutality in his methods of breaking Mark, even using him as a tool to kill innocent civilians. And the way he does it so casually is really grim. Nolan spent his entire life conquering planets and killing those who resisted, so doing something like this doesn't even faze him in the least. The callousness he displays as he emotionally scars his son is unimaginable, showing how far he's willing to go to prove his point. And seeing what it does to Mark, helplessly trying to stop it but to no avail, is grim. And even after that, he still doesn't give in, still trying to fight back, trying to convince Nolan he's wrong. Nolan and Mark's conflict is almost like seeing an unstoppable force and an immovable object. Both of them are so headstrong in what they're fighting to represent, even when one is completely outmatched. And it finally comes down to a merciless beatdown. Nolan goes all out on Mark, not holding back a single punch, and it gets gruesome. Not just the blood, but the sound of the punching and shattering teeth. Everything about this battle is chilling, even more so than the comics. Mark's desperate and futile attempt to save people, Nolan's brutal methods of manipulating him, and the really spiteful words he speaks as he annihilates him. And shockingly, after all that brutality, Nolan is in awe, practically stunned by how Mark still hasn't given in. After all that physical, mental, and emotional abuse, he still acts in defiance. He still doesn't give up. And seeing this defiance leaves him struggling to deliver the finishing blow. He finally stops, lying alongside his son. And then he remembers a day of Mark's childhood, watching him win his first baseball game. A simpler time before he began his mission to conquer Earth. At first he acts stubborn and nihilistic towards the prospect of day-to-day human activity, still hung up in how insignificant it feels compared to the Viltrum Empire. But Debbie comes along and talks him down, showing him the little things in life that make it worth living, helping Nolan to appreciate his son's achievement. Even before he started developing powers, Nolan expresses pride in his son, and starts to open up to his life on Earth as something besides an act. His initial reaction makes sense considering the thousands of years he spent living with the ideology of Viltrum. He's reacting from an outsider's perspective. He doesn't have any love-based connections because Viltrum was built on an ideology of power and Darwinism. He feels like he's wasting his time waiting for Mark to become a Viltrumite, because nothing on Earth connects with his beliefs. But after taking the time to slow down and acknowledge his son, he begins to see how his time on Earth could be something more. He starts taking Debbie's advice to heart, learning to truly experience his life with humanity. Holding Mark up, expressing how happy he was to see him win the game, that's when he truly started to become human. The flashback ends, and we see Nolan processing everything going on in his mind. His internal conflict, his memories of the life he had on Earth, his family, his duty to Viltrum, all of it has left him stunned, barely able to contain his frustration. With all his options exhausted, Nolan simply asks, why? Why is Mark defying the inevitable? Why does he keep fighting knowing how pointless it is to save humanity? How he'll outlive all of them and see them destroy themselves? What is he going to have when everyone else is gone? And Mark's answer is Nolan. When all is said and done, he'll still have his father. The way Mark says that line, trying to hold on to the hope that his father still has some humanity in him, it's actually very heartbreaking. It reminds me a lot of Return of the Jedi, where Luke tries to reach out to Darth Vader by appealing to his humanity. A son longing for his father's love. Even when beaten within an inch of his life, Mark can't bring himself to disown Nolan, not giving up on him. Because deep underneath the persona of an alien tyrant, his father is still in there. After all that emotional and physical brutality, he still called him Dad. And the way Nolan reflexively responded to it, the same way any parent would when their child needed them, you can see his Viltrumite ideology falling apart at the seams. If anything, this is what kept Mark from following the same dark path as Nolan, the human side he inherited from his mother. Her love, compassion, and value of family. And it's this expression of love and compassion that finally turns Nolan around. The line that finally helps him see through his own lie. He's able to do it with a single brief utterance of love for his father. And the reason why it works is because the conflict was developed. This small line hits because it took a whole lot of time to set up. And if anything, this is what the title of the show refers to. This is what makes Mark invincible. Not because he's super powerful or unstoppable or because he can't be defeated, but because his humanity is unbreakable. This is the moment that fully symbolizes who he is as a character. Mark might not be invincible physically, but his spirit is. And this is where I come back to what I mentioned earlier. How the fight between him and Nolan is the ultimate test of his willpower. Nolan did everything in his power to break Mark, to convince him to side with the Empire. But in the end, he doesn't give in. Mark doesn't submit to Viltrum. But at the same time, he still holds on to his love for his father. Nolan failed to break Mark's spirit, and in turn, only proved how fragile his own was. Mark demonstrates that strength doesn't lie in the physical appearance and dominating those you feel inferior. He shows that strength lies in support, love, and the willingness to stand up for what's right, even doing it alone. His words hit Nolan harder than anything Cecil threw at him, and with that, he's left in shame, coming to terms with his humanity and that he hurt his child. A parent's greatest failure. You can feel Nolan's hatred for himself and that he's trying so hard to convince himself that he doesn't love Mark and Debbie, but he does love and care about them. Those 20 years didn't mean nothing to him, they meant everything to him. Viltrumites know nothing about compassion, and yet this little thing called humanity broke through and got Nolan to feel something for his son. He couldn't hold the weight of him beaten and bloodied by his hands, and his son still loved him in the end. The guilt overwhelms him, causing him to fly away, leaving the earth in tears. Nolan was trying so hard to convince himself he was right, in spite of how wrong it all feels. As much as he looks down on humanity, he's come to enjoy his new life, and he's fighting that part of himself as much as he's fighting his son. Deep down he knows he's more human than he realizes, and Mark knows it too. He regrets what he did, but it's too late to turn back or possibly seek forgiveness since people all over the world witnessed him turn out to be a tyrant. In a way, it helps to show the real reason why Nolan was initially unmoved by Mark getting his powers. He knew the life that he built on Earth was coming to an end. Now he has to abandon it and commit to his duty as a soldier. A part of him was telling him that his mission was wrong, but he couldn't accept it because doing so would shatter his identity. And yet, he still doesn't go through with it. He knew that completing his mission meant he would have to kill his son, but he just can't bring himself to do it. Throughout this fight, he tries to brutally demonstrate how apart from humanity he is. But in this one moment, we see a crack through his facade. None of this feels right to him anymore. Beating his son to near death, someone who still professes their love for him, now it feels wrong. He's going through denial, anger, sadness, regret, and finally a painful but realistic mixture of acceptance and shame. With just a few words, Marcus planted a seed of doubt in Nolan's mind, suggesting that Viltrum is wrong. Some might suggest how crazy it is for Mark to try and reach out to Nolan in spite of the atrocities he committed, but it's meant to show how this could be the start of a new direction for Viltrum. Nolan spent his whole life believing in them because of how strong they became through their methods. But by becoming strong, they've lost any feelings of sympathy and compassion. And by not disowning Nolan, still believing there's a chance that he can better himself, Mark is showing how he can change all that. Changing the Viltrumites to become a better species by learning to develop compassion. Mark saved the world by continuing to believe in his father. And Nolan, for the first time in his life, felt like an absolute monster, ashamed of who he was, almost as if he was yelling at himself, instead of Mark. Everything about Nolan's character arc in this season is astounding. It's laid out in a way that makes you want to see where the character is going to go, acting as a strong hook and getting you invested in watching the rest of the show. By establishing him as a villain early on, they create a mystery surrounding why Nolan killed the Guardians instead of who killed them, which makes for a more interesting mystery with how they were setting him up as a distant figure. It also creates a greater sense of tension, with the audience being aware of how the other characters are interacting with someone who's secretly a cold-blooded tyrant. It also adds to the mystery with you wondering who's going to figure out the identity of the killer first and how they're going to react to it. And as the mystery escalates, so does the threat of Nolan, with each passing episode establishing how powerful he is, and how brutal he can get. It perfectly builds up to the worldwide reveal of him being a murderer, and Mark finding out the cold truth about his father. It gave Nolan enough time to establish himself as the villain while also raising the stakes of his ruthlessness. And his actions throughout the final episode make sense. He's conflicted about where his loyalty lies, but it's not enough to break his duty to Viltrum. And what he does to Mark is sensible considering what's at stake if they defy the Empire. In a way, he's doing this to protect his son, because he knows defiance against Viltrum will get him killed. But Mark doesn't stop resisting. He still fights for his home, even with the knowledge that he's completely outmatched. And he doesn't give up on reaching out to Nolan's better nature. And with him looking at his hands stained with his son's blood, showing regret for the lines he crossed to keep lying to himself, it's incredibly tragic. Nolan didn't raise Mark as a Viltrumite because deep down, he began to enjoy his life among humans, and he didn't want his son to grow up the way he did. Nolan is what a number of villains painting themselves as sympathetic tried to be and failed. Unlike the Diamonds from Steven Universe or Abby from The Last of Us Part 2, Nolan is a fully developed and fleshed out character, resembling a real person. It's amazing how sympathetic he is, even with the atrocities he committed. You can really tell he's a conflicted man from episode 1. He really loves his family, but he also has a duty to his people that he knows he has to complete, and that to stand against them would risk everything he values. You really end up feeling for the guy, even knowing he's a monster. And I do need to give credit to J.K. Simmons for not only perfectly capturing the character, but elevating him. I'm convinced that no other person could have possibly played Nolan like he does. He captures every aspect to a T, taking him to a level that I didn't think was possible. He captures his malice, mercilessness, deceit, but also his restraint, love, and softness. He captures the genuine affection he has for his family, as well as his ruthlessness and inner turmoil. And with that combined with the remarkable writing they do for him makes for a phenomenal character. I heard the creator of the original comics is working on this show and they're aiming to correct certain mistakes they made with their initial work. And so far they're doing a pretty good job. So much of the source material feels like it's being elevated in some way. From the story, to making the characters feel more genuine, and even adding more detail to Nolan's story. If they keep going at this rate, it could end up being one of the greatest shows of this decade. Invincible is shaping up to be a great take on the superhero genre. From the incredible characters, to the amazing handling of darker elements, to the highly talented voice cast, to the immersive storytelling. I really look forward to what awaits us in future seasons, to see what'll happen next, in the story of Mark and Nolan Grayson. Thank you guys so much for watching. I really appreciate you taking the time to listen to what I have to say. I actually have a second Invincible video in the works but wanted to get this one out a little early since I was a little bit behind in the initial upload date I had in mind. I'll be covering the supporting characters of the show and it should be ready by next week. If you liked what you saw here, feel free to check out my Patreon in the description. Every little bit of support helps and I look forward to seeing you again sometime soon. Until next time, take care.